Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 3 of Series 7. The question this evening is, how and why has mind or consciousness been overlooked and neglected? A reading, for those who want it, from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 3. So today we are discussing how and why consciousness has been overlooked and neglected. This is unexpected because we are ourselves conscious beings. So how could we overlook our most significant feature? Yet we must first show that consciousness has indeed been overlooked. The neglect of consciousness is a serious problem because consciousness represents human subjectivity, and it is in the realm of subjectivity that issues such as ethics, aesthetics, meaning and purpose are posed. Other areas like religion, science and conceptual theory have proved to be inadequate foundations. So it is in the realm of subjectivity, consciousness and value that I'm proposing to find answers to life. Of course, science, medicine, psychology and facts of life are crucially important. But as I and others argue elsewhere, they can't resolve questions of human existence. The neglect of consciousness is interestingly illuminated by a distinction made by Barry Dainton. Dainton makes a distinction between the phenomenal self and the psychological self. The phenomenal self is one's personal identity in which one apprehends oneself as oneself. The psychological self consists of all one's beliefs, values, memories and perceptions. To illustrate this distinction, Dainton makes the use of the fictional idea of teleportation as we find it in Star Trek. In these scenarios, people are changed into data and teleported somewhere else. They are reconstructed exactly as before, down to every neuron and memory. They believe themselves to be the same person as before, their psychological self. But the question is, are they the same person? They think they are the same person because they have the memories of the same person. But Dainton considers the view that teleportation is a form of suicide. This is because the phenomenal self would not have the same phenomenal identity as the previous person. This thought experiment distinguishes the phenomenal self from the psychological self, but the phenomenal self is usually overlooked in fictional considerations of teleportation. And this shows how crucial aspects of consciousness have been neglected and overlooked. I will eventually conclude with phenomenological and inherently structural reasons for overlooking consciousness. But I first want to explore several reasons why consciousness has been neglected and overlooked. But to do that, we need to define the consciousness that we are talking about, as well as to define the significance of the neglect of mind or consciousness. The concept of mind has implications for philosophy in general, as well as for questions of human existence. Physicalist or other theories of mind have implications for understanding the nature of mind, its emergence in the world, free will and other issues. And with respect to the definition of mind or consciousness, I myself hold an interactionist theory of mind and a structural conception of consciousness as a relation and process. I have previously explained that view in detail and won't be doing so again today. We can nevertheless offer a provisional definition of mind or consciousness, that is, by agreeing with John Searle that consciousness is basically all those states that we are conscious of. And mind or consciousness are often used interchangeably, but their differentiation can further our definition. The more general concept of mind includes every aspect of mental life, including the unconscious and animal minds. But as above, consciousness comprises of everything that I am conscious of: pains, thoughts, wishes, etc. Psychology, though, might be thought of as a study of mind, whereas phenomenology is a study of consciousness. And in these studies, my approach is predominantly phenomenological rather than psychological. Although to demonstrate the neglect of mind, I will adopt historical and psychological approaches. In ancient times and in religion, mind or consciousness was understood as soul or spirit. And in an even more basic way, body language was used in Hebrew and Greek to represent the soul or spirit. Hebrew used the terms nefesh or ruach, meaning the breath of life. The ancient Greek words pneuma and psyche similarly translate as the breath of life. Ludwig Feuerbach's projection theory offers an explanation of how religion fails to represent human consciousness. That is, for various reasons, mankind cannot understand himself in his own terms as consciousness. So, on Feuerbach's account, mankind projects himself outside himself as another being into God. Mankind thereby comes to understand himself vicariously through his projection onto God. Some details of Feuerbach's account have been questioned, but his challenge is taken seriously by theologians. For example, in the 19th century, even Friedrich Engels was moved to exclaim that we are all Feuerbachians. Other commentators add that Feuerbach's work have been absorbed by Marx, Freud and Dewey. And projection theory has been widely employed by such as Hume and John Locke. Ancient Greek thought might be assumed to have rectified this neglect, but this isn't the case. Reviewing a number of articles on Aristotle's philosophy of mind, the researcher W.F.D. Hardy found that Aristotle had no concept of consciousness, or not one corresponding closely to ours. Moreover, the evidence shows that this neglect of consciousness has continued into the modern world. Yet demonstrating an absence or a neglect is more difficult than demonstration of a presence of something. But John Searle and others agree that the study of consciousness has been thought of as eccentric. And numerous thinkers can be quoted on our lack of understanding of consciousness. For example, Edmund Husserl stated that what we lack above all is a certain general insight into the essence of consciousness in general. David Chalmers writes that we are entirely in the dark about how consciousness fits into the natural order. And Bernard Williams talks about a pervasive obscurity in our idea of consciousness. and John Searle expresses similar concern in his book The Rediscovery of Mind. My favourite quotation is Stuart Sutherland's entry in the International Dictionary of Psychology. I quote, "Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written on it." Of course, I disagree and refute his claim by writing substantively about it. But more empirical evidence can be cited to establish that consciousness has indeed been neglected. Firstly, the word consciousness was only first introduced in 1681 by John Locke. Secondly, psychology as an explicit study of mind is only a couple of 100 years old. And in my view, the physicalist inclinations of both an analytic philosophy and postmodernism neglect consciousness. Yet one of the most egregious ways in which consciousness is neglected is behaviorism, that is, the relegation of subjective states to the examination of physical behaviour for scientific convenience. But vying for the most egregious neglect of consciousness is its denial by such as Tenet and Ricoeur. Tenet writes that the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon. In short, the mind is the brain. And Ricoeur holds that talk of mental states will disappear like superstitions about ghosts and angels. So if academic philosophy has neglected the phenomenon of consciousness, we might want to turn to other sources. Among these alternatives are New Age views and the Oriental and Buddhist origins that they derive from. On the Buddhist Vedanta view, absolute consciousness is both conscious and more fundamental than matter. And on this view, there are different expressions of absolute, cosmic, individual and indwelling consciousness. Yet paradoxically, the true nature of consciousness is claimed to be itself one and non-dual. But whatever you call it, the Buddhist view of consciousness is faced with intractable problems. That is, how can consciousness be both the ground of existence and the phenomenon that we experience as sentient and cognitive? Moreover, what produced consciousness and how can consciousness produce matter? The Vedanta answers that the substratum of the universe is pure consciousness, or sit, even finer than energy, prana, and that absolute consciousness did not become this world, it only appears to have done so. But these answers only fall back onto dogma and don't resolve the problems of consciousness. Yet such Buddhist and Hindu views still permeate modern thought in our understanding of individual consciousness. For example, for Schopenhauer and Feuerbach, consciousness doesn't depend on individuals, they only participate in it. Even Husserl had difficulties reconciling the independence of individual consciousness with intersubjectivity. But Bernard Williams and others, including myself, regard individual separateness as a premise of modern thought. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness is everywhere and in everything, is another view with Oriental roots. Yet panpsychism is favoured by Chalmers, McGilchrist, Blakemore, Strawson, Whitehead and others. Yet John Searle finds some of its implications, like conscious thermostats, absurd, and I agree. I take the acceptance of panpsychism as an indication of how little consciousness is understood. Against panpsychism, consciousness has properties like intentionality, cognition, sentience and graduation. But these properties patently do not exist in everything and aren't everywhere in the world, except of course on a redefinition of consciousness that is nevertheless contradictory. It's like saying that something can be black and white all over at the same time. Yet we can now get to New Age literature, which similarly seems to have a tenuous grasp of consciousness. For example, David R. Hawkins, PhD, offers a map of consciousness levels that is far from credible. That is, it features 17 levels with shame at the bottom and enlightenment at the top. And it ascends through other levels like guilt, grief, desire, acceptance, love and peace. But these qualities are morally desirable or undesirable qualities rather than levels of consciousness. So his lower levels are presented as bad and his higher levels are presented as good. But this is contrary to a natural account of graduation in the animal and human world. It also fallaciously attributes moral qualities to natural features. But it would be remiss of me not to mention phenomenology as a dedicated description of consciousness. A key feature here is Husserl's phenomenological reduction of focusing purely on consciousness. This is nothing like the standard physicalist, a reduction of the mind to an aspect of the material world. Husserl described it as a bracketing out of scientific and psychological understanding. But even Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty and other phenomenologists believed a complete reduction was not possible. They doubted that presuppositionalist observation is possible or could have very much to say. Yet they nevertheless saw phenomenology as giving special access to the world and to consciousness. But Husserl insisted that only the reduction provided genuine access to the subjective domain of inner experience, and he attributed great significance to the reduction, saying that whoever misunderstands the reduction is lost. Given this insistence, we might look again at the idea given such portentous significance by Husserl. Others like Dan Zahavi and Joel Smith also believe that we should look again at the reduction. I think that the reduction can be reinterpreted as an awareness of the significance and the neglect of consciousness. There are many reasons why consciousness has been neglected in both the ancient and the modern world. Yet this neglect is both anachronistic and unexpected because, as we've said, we are conscious beings. And Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" seems to be an endorsement of our own self-consciousness. Yet it's not only indicative of a certainty of consciousness, it's also indicative of its late discovery and neglect. And it's extraordinary that this explicit but limited account of mind was only given in the 17th century. That is, Descartes' limited and misleading conception of mind was of a thinking's substance. But Paul Ricoeur challenges the cogito as a presumed certainty which can be deceived about itself. Merleau-Ponty further writes that it is of the essence of consciousness to forget its own phenomena, and Husserl and Sartre have also noted the difficulty of apprehending consciousness. And similarly, in the 18th century, David Hume famously said, "When I search for myself, I can never find myself as a self. I can never catch myself without a perception, without which I may truly be said not to exist." But Hume seems to think of himself as another object in his field of perception, where he is the originator of his field of perception, like an eye that cannot see itself. This provides another explanation of both the denial and neglect of consciousness. The neglect of consciousness can also be illustrated by the neglect of its various aspects. For example, Kant's Copernican revolution was the first to recognize the active role of mind in perception, and the idea of the unconscious wasn't clearly recognized until Schopenhauer and later Freud. More relevantly to my own inquiries, the notion of value has been widely neglected. For example, in the 19th century, science was mistakenly thought to be value-free, not value-laden. Before exploring the inherent reasons for this neglect, we should outline more mundane explanations. Among these are genetic and psychological conditions such as autism, also described as mind blindness. One book on such is entitled "The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat" by Oliver Sacks. Yet firstly, there's also a materialist bias in scientific and analytic methods in understanding the mind as the brain. Scientific objectivity has endeavoured to remove the observing consciousness from its analyses. Secondly, there's a lack of relevant ideas and language to conceptualize and discuss the mind and mental states. Without words and concepts, topics become indivisible even for physical phenomena. For example, like consciousness, we can be oblivious to the air we breathe and live in. Only when some clever Greek immersed an upturned cup in water and asked what stops the water from going in was there a realization that something was in there, air. Thirdly, a large part of the mind is unobservable in the form of the preconscious and the unconscious, and explicit awareness of the structures and mechanisms of mind would also be counterproductive in life. That is, genetics, the unconscious, and structures of consciousness are all guiding human behaviour. But if these were always in the forefront of consciousness, unencumbered action would be impossible. So for practical evolutionary reasons, these structures must remain hidden together with consciousness. We have been talking about the neglect of consciousness in history and in theory. Yet for the apprehension or neglect of anything, we need first-hand experience in order to comprehend it. For example, it's impossible to explain what a computer is to someone who has never seen or used one. In my view, there's a similar problem with the first-hand or immediate grasp of consciousness. I want to present a phenomenological account of this problem in terms of an error theory of consciousness. Error theory here denotes the pervasive yet neglected tendency of self-consciousness to forget itself. It tends to regress into the preconscious, to overlook its attributes and even its own existence. Error theory of consciousness can be compared to John Locke's error theory of value. Locke argues that values have been mistakenly taken as objective rather than subjective. I want to make three structural arguments for the obscure and self-obfuscating character of consciousness. 1. The problem of the immersion of consciousness in its own transparent perceptions. 2. Regression is possible due to the graduation of mind in personal and evolutionary development. And 3. Attenuated cognition or non-referentiality due to a lack of contrasting background. I will firstly explain self-obfuscation of consciousness for what we can call the immersion of consciousness in itself. That is, because consciousness is immersed in its own perceptions, it has difficulty in perceiving itself. As noted earlier, consciousness is transparent and sees through itself to observe the world. There are many examples and metaphors that illustrate this problem of immersion and oversight. For example, human consciousness is like being a fish unaware of the water it swims in or is immersed in. Or again, the presence of air being overlooked until are discovered with the upturned vessel in water. We also have the saying of not seeing the wood for trees, and we earlier mentioned the idea of the eye not being able to see itself. But of course, the eye can see itself when a mirror is held up in front of it. And this is exactly what is going on with the capacity of reflective human consciousness. Yet there is still a need for a reflective capacity here, which raises the possibility of opacity or obfuscation. And reflective consciousness also raises the possibility of reflecting on that reflective consciousness. And this can invoke an infinite regress, which can be a further impediment to clear self-consciousness. So self-consciousness is prone to overlook its own processes and perceptions in which it is immersed. And this kind of transparency leads consciousness to forget itself and even overlook its own existence. But I presented the idea of immersion largely by metaphor and illustration. Yet the idea of regression can be explained explicitly with the help of structures of consciousness. That is, the notion of the graduation of consciousness enables it to regress as well as to develop. Graduation of mind or consciousness can be applied in two ways. 1, to mental states, 2, to mind as a whole. Examples of graduation of mental states, like belief, love and pain, are relatively uncontentious. Yet the graduation of mind as a whole is less familiar and needs to be explained and argued. A case for the graduation of mind can be derived from species evolution and personal development. My basic argument would be as follows. 1, different creatures exist and individuals develop with different levels of mind. 2, these are manifestly different levels of mind or consciousness. 3. Therefore, there must be mental graduation in order to accommodate different levels of mind. Graduation of mind is, however, more contentious than graduation of mental states. Yet Bernard Williams rejects what he calls the all or nothing or ungraduated view of mind. And John Eccles speaks of progressive development of the biological evolution of consciousness. But several thinkers like Sartre, Colin McGinn and Tim Bain oppose a graduated view of mind. Sartre holds that it's impossible to conceive of consciousness to the degree to which it is not conscious of itself. This is contestable because consciousness can have less awareness of its own existence. For example, this is the case in chimpanzees and arguably in different degrees of human awareness. The binary thinking opposed to this view is a misapplication of the principle of excluded middle. The excluded middle is an argument in logic that can be misapplied to minds or matter. The argument is that an item either exists or doesn't exist. It can't partially exist. But I have argued the case for graduation in the case of consciousness more extensively elsewhere. So I now want to employ the idea of graduation to explain the difficulty of apprehending consciousness. My argument for obfuscation and self-obfuscation from regression proceeds in the following way. To begin with, consciousness expresses different characteristics at different levels. Pre-reflective or typically animal consciousness is not explicitly aware of its own existence. Human consciousness typically has capacities such as personal identity and is self-aware. But reflective consciousness isn't fixed, guaranteed by God or Sartrean claims of impossibility. It is a product of neurology and other factors like relations with the external world. It's subject to loss of capacities in weakness, sleep, senility, coma, and eventual cessation in death. Therefore, the relatively new and fragile capacity of self-awareness is subject to regression into earlier states, and earlier states of consciousness lack self-consciousness. Goethe describes this tendency to regress into more primitive states in the following way. Man cannot persist long in a conscious state if he must throw himself back into the unconscious, for his root lives there. So my argument is that consciousness is subject to graduation and thereby to regression. And in regression to more basic levels of consciousness, reflective consciousness can be overlooked. That is, human beings tend to lose their reflective capacities and even overlook their own existence. So ordinary observation as well as phenomenology seems to support this view. A third way to explain the obfuscation of consciousness is due to what I call singular or non-referentiality. Singular or non-referentiality is a form of attenuated cognition or reduced or absent context. I previously used the term attenuated cognition to explain both moral fortitude and mysteriousness. Attenuated cognition produces mysteriousness due to the limited contrast or references to context. Attenuated cognition or mysteriousness is a limited context of understanding that also produces self-obfuscation. Conversely, standard perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding. For example, a white spot on a white board isn't a spot. It needs contrast in order to be seen. Ferdinand de Saussure also held that meaning is created by contrasts between different words, and Wittgenstein's cluster theory of meaning called for numerous complex interrelations. But self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. Self-consciousness is thereby limited to a singular reference to itself and no references or context. Physical objects can be understood, 1, by comparison, and 2, with other physical objects in the world. For example, motorbikes can be understood more deeply by comparisons with other motorbikes. But again, self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. I have immediate and a priori awareness of my own consciousness, but my awareness of other people's consciousness is intuitive, empirical, reasoned, and a posteriori. So this paucity of reference available to self-consciousness produces self-obfuscation. That is, self-consciousness is inclined to overlook its own existence. Moreover, self-consciousness should not be able to exist in the absence of ulterior references, and consciousness should not be able to become self-conscious, but it does. Because self-consciousness does exist, we need a further non-referential account of meaning. So I've used the notions of immersion, regression, and singular reference as structural ways to explain obfuscation. There were also a lot of conceptual, linguistic, and psychological ways of explaining obfuscation. But I'm not primarily interested in such contingent methods of explanation. Self-obfuscation is also significant because it tells us things about consciousness. 1, it tells us something about the character of consciousness. 2, its neglect suggests that something important has been overlooked. And 3, consciousness opens the door to a new way of understanding, as Husserl insisted. My general point is to explicate the problem of the obfuscation of consciousness in an account that I call error theory. Error theory denotes the pervasive yet neglected tendency of self-consciousness to forget itself. It tends to regress into the preconscious, to overlook its attributes and even its own existence. In conclusion, I can reiterate my view of consciousness as a foundation and nexus of human subjectivity, and that the neglect of consciousness has repercussions throughout philosophy as well as for human life. I initially outlined a number of mundane reasons for the neglect of consciousness. These included language, religion, projection theory, and psychological conditions like autism, as well as methods like analytic philosophy, physicalism, scientific objectivity, and behaviorism. Yet I'm looking for phenomenological reasons for obfuscation, not linguistic, conceptual, social or historical reasons. And I have several reasons for doing this. Two of them are: one, a first-hand apprehension of consciousness explains both its neglect and its subsequent examination. Two, phenomenological structures are the most effective way of understanding consciousness. So I gave three structural features in explaining the obscure and self-obfuscating character of consciousness. One, the immersion of consciousness in its own transparent perceptions. Two, regression due to the graduation of mind. And three, attenuated cognition or non-referentiality due to a lack of contrasting background. Again, realizing the neglect of consciousness is a beginning of the realization of consciousness. That is, consciousness as the basis for an understanding of the most vital dimension of human life, as well as a basis for asking the question, what can we do with the phenomenon of consciousness? And I answer this question in terms of value as a constituent of consciousness. That is, the pursuit of value as the will to value, resulting in a sufficiency of value. So let me have your comments and criticisms on websites like meetup.com and philosophy of value workshops.